I've never been one to chase the spotlight or crave company. My life was just fine revolving around my job as an online tutor, from the quiet of my own home, my haven, the house I inherited after my parents passed. I kept to a simple routine: wake up, work, and maybe, just maybe, if I felt like seeing another human face, I'd stroll to the local pastry shop down the block. The pastry shop was my occasional escape. Mrs. Evelyn, the saleswoman, was the type to know everyone's business, but in a charming sort of way. The shop smelled like cinnamon and sugar, and the bell above the door jingled with a quaint, welcoming sound every time I pushed it open. It was on one of these routine visits that Mrs. Evelyn decided to play matchmaker. As she slid a steaming cup of coffee across the counter, her eyes twinkled like she was onto something. "You know, Tessa, my son's just about your age," she started, arranging the pastries with more vigor than necessary. "Still single too. You should meet him sometime." I laughed it off, stirring cream into my coffee. "Thanks, but I'm alright on my own." "Really?" Mrs. Evelyn shrugged, a mischievous smile on her face. "Well, we'll just see about that." I thought nothing of it until my next visit, when I opened the door to find not just the usual scent of baked goods, but also a new face behind the counter. He was tall, awkward in a charming way, and when he turned around, his smile was immediately disarming. "Hi, Tessa, I'm Jack, Evelyn's son. I think she's mentioned me?" His words caught me off guard. Mentioned him? More like schemed up an entire meet-cute without telling me. "Oh, yeah, she might have said something," I replied, trying not to show my surprise. Jack handed me a blueberry muffin, on the house, and leaned on the counter. "She thinks she's being slick, setting us up like this. Sorry if it's weird." I couldn't help but laugh. "A bit unexpected, but it's fine. She means well." As he talked about his job and his hobbies, which, surprisingly, included a lot of reading, something we had in common, I found myself genuinely interested. Jack wasn't just some guy his mom wanted to push on a customer, he was actually pretty cool. "Do you come here often then? To get away from the chaos of the world?" he asked, gesturing to the shop. "Yeah, it's my little retreat. Good coffee, better pastries, and now, apparently, decent company," I said with a smirk. Jack grinned, clearly pleased. "Decent? I'll take that as a compliment, coming from someone who'd rather be at home." The conversation flowed easily after that, the initial awkwardness melting away like butter on a hot muffin. By the time I left the shop, phone numbers exchanged and a promise to grab dinner together sometime soon hanging between us, I had to admit, Mrs. Evelyn might have been onto something after all. A year of dating flew by like it was nothing. Jack and I got along easily, slipping into a comfortable routine of shared dinners and late-night talks about everything and nothing. It wasn't long before we were making plans for a wedding and, not long after that, Jack moved into my house, the same house I grew up in, the one I inherited from my folks. Jack's parents lived just a few blocks away, which at first seemed like a blessing. Having family nearby, I thought, would be nice for a change. Initially, it was all casual visits and pleasant enough dinners. But soon after the wedding, the atmosphere began to change. His mom, Mrs. Evelyn, who had once been the sweet lady from the pastry shop, started showing up more often, and not just for casual visits. Each time she came over, it was like she had a checklist in her head of all the things I was doing wrong. "You know, Tessa, Jack likes his shirts ironed a certain way," she mentioned one afternoon, pulling out a supposedly clean shirt from the closet and examining it like it was evidence in a trial. I tried to keep my cool, biting back any sharp retorts. "I'm usually caught up with my online classes during the day, so sometimes things like that slip my mind," I explained, hoping she'd understand. Mrs. Evelyn sked, shaking her head as she placed the shirt back. "When I was your age, I kept the house spotless and worked part-time at the bakery. It's really about managing your time better." The comment stung, especially coming from her. It was as if the simple, kind woman I met at the shop had been swapped out for a relentless critic. Each visit seemed to have a new complaint: the food was too bland, the floors weren't swept well enough, or I wasn't taking good enough care of Jack. Jack's dad was more on the quiet side, but he had his moments too. "Lunch isn't ready," he'd grumble, checking his watch dramatically as if he'd been starving for days. "I work from home, yes, but I'm actually working, not just hanging around," I tried to explain, more than once, my voice firm but controlled. They nodded, murmured something about understanding, but the next visit, it'd start all over again. I found myself dreading the sound of the doorbell, knowing it likely meant another critique was coming my way. Despite the growing frustration, I held my tongue. Arguing wouldn't help, I thought. Jack was caught in the middle, trying to smooth things over, telling me his parents just meant well and that maybe they were just set in their ways. "They're from a different time, Tessa, you know? They don't get the whole work-from-home thing," Jack would say, trying to bridge the gap between us. But no matter how much I nodded and smiled, a part of me burned with every sideways comment about my cooking or cleaning. They still live separately, though, I reassured myself after each visit. "It's just a couple of hours a week. I can handle this." One sunny afternoon, I was wrapping up an online session with a student when I heard the sound of a truck pulling up outside. Curious, I peeked through the window and saw Jack helping his parents unload big bags and boxes from a truck that was parked out front. I walked outside, trying to keep my tone light. "Hey, what's all this?" Jack wiped his brow and gave me a sheepish look. Well, it looks like my parents are going to stay with us for a bit." "A bit? What does that mean, Jack?" I asked, my voice rising, despite my attempt to stay calm. "It's just temporary, Tessa," he said quickly, almost tripping over his words. "Their house is being rented out for extra income. They thought it'd be easier to stay here for now." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just a visit. This was moving in. "Jack, don't we usually talk about big decisions like this?" I asked, my voice tight. Before he could reply, Mrs. Evelyn came bustling over, her voice full of false cheer. "Oh, darling, isn't this wonderful? We'll get to spend so much more time together." I forced a smile. "Mrs. Evelyn, how long are you planning to stay?" She waved a dismissive hand as if I'd asked about the weather. "Oh, just a while, dear. Until we sort things out. We're family now, right? Families help each other." I glanced at Jack, waiting for some support, but he avoided my gaze. That's when Mr. Peterson chimed in, his voice booming across the yard. "Where do you want this box, son? Should it go in the spare room?" They had it all planned out. And from the looks of it, my opinion didn't matter. It's been literally a few days, my home no longer felt like mine. Mrs. Evelyn took over the kitchen, criticizing every meal I made. "You need to add more salt, Tessa. And this meat is all wrong. Jack likes it tender." I clenched my fists, counting to 10 in my head before responding. "I've been cooking for Jack just fine till now, Mrs. Evelyn." She sked and shook her head, muttering about young people not knowing how to take advice. Then there were the comments about the house. "You really should clean more often," Mrs. Evelyn would say, running her finger along a shelf and inspecting the dust. "In my house, you could eat off the floors." Jack, for his part, was stuck in the middle. He'd come home from work to find us at odds and sigh. "Can't you two just get along? She's trying to help." By taking over our lives? I'd shoot back, frustration boiling over. Every day was a struggle. I felt like I was losing bits of my home and myself with each passing moment. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words and stifled anger. I loved Jack, but living with his parents under my roof, with their constant critiques and disregard for my boundaries, was becoming unbearable. Every day started the same since Jack's parents moved in. The shrill alarm of the old clock they brought with them would pierce the quiet of dawn, signaling the start of what felt like a marathon. Before I could even sip my morning coffee, Mrs. Evelyn would already be bustling around the kitchen, a storm dressed in an apron. "You're up late today, Tessa," she'd comment, as if 7 a.m. was noon. I'd mumble something about having a late session the night before and brace myself for the avalanche of tasks she deemed necessary to start the day. One particular morning, as I tried to prep for an online tutoring session, Mrs. Evelyn barged into my makeshift office with a laundry basket full of clothes that apparently needed urgent washing. "Here, do these next. And make sure you separate the whites this time," she instructed, her voice leaving no room for argument. I bit back my frustration. "Mrs. Evelyn, I've got back-to-back sessions today. Can it wait?" She planted her hands on her hips, her favorite stance for lectures. "This will just take a minute. Priorities, dear. You can teach any time." "But this is my job," I countered, my voice rising despite my resolve to keep calm. "I have students waiting." She shrugged, unfazed. "They can wait a few more minutes. Family first, right?" It was always like this, her needs and rules overshadowing mine. I was drowning in a sea of unwelcome chores and constant criticism, and Jack was no lifeboat. He'd leave early for work, kiss me goodbye, and vanish, leaving me to navigate the choppy waters with his parents alone. Lunchtime was another battle. If it wasn't Mrs. Evelyn criticizing the saltiness of the soup, it was Mr. Peterson complaining about the timing. "It's past noon, and lunch isn't ready," he'd grumble, checking his watch like it was a countdown to some catastrophic event. I'd clench my teeth, forcing a smile. "It's almost done, Mr. Peterson. Just a few more minutes. It should be on the table by now. Back in my day, we had schedules," he'd mutter, his words edged with a bitterness that soured the food even before it hit the table. One day, fed up with the mounting pressure, I snapped. It was a Tuesday, nothing special about it, except for my patients wearing thinner than the soles of the slippers Mrs. Evelyn insisted I wear inside. "I am not your maid, and this is not a diner," I exclaimed as Mrs. Evelyn hovered over my shoulder while I chopped vegetables. "I can't keep up with this and my work. It's too much." Mrs. Evelyn recoiled as if I'd slapped her. "I'm just trying to maintain some standards in my son's home," she retorted, her voice sharp and cold. "It's my home too," I shot back, slamming the knife down on the cutting board. "And I can't do everything around here. I'm working, too, remember?" Jack walked in right then, his timing as impeccable as ever. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking from his flustered mother to me. I shook my head, too weary to explain again. "Ask your mother," I said, leaving the kitchen and the mounting pile of grievances behind. Everything took a sharp turn downhill when Mrs. Evelyn decided to quit her job at the bakery. She said she was tired and figured she'd be more use around the house helping out. If only that were true. Instead, her idea of helping was bursting into my home office during an online tutoring session and yelling that it was time to start cooking dinner. It was mortifying. "Are you going to start on dinner, Tessa? It's getting late, and we're all hungry," she bellowed one afternoon, not caring that my microphone was on and my students could hear every word. I muted the mic, cheeks burning with embarrassment. "Mrs. Evelyn, I'm still working. Can we talk about this later?" But she just waved her hand dismissively and walked out, leaving me to apologize to my students and try to regain my professional composure. Then there was Mr. Peterson, who seemed to think I just played on the computer all day. "I don't see why you're always so busy," he'd grumble. "Looks to me like you're just tapping away at games." "It's not games, it's my job," I'd snap back, sharper than I intended. "This is how I earn our living now." "That's right, our living." Because 3 months into this new family arrangement, Jack came home in the middle of the day, looking like he'd lost a fight. "I got laid off, Tessa," he confessed in a hushed tone, checking to make sure his parents weren't around. "Please don't tell my folks yet, I don't want to worry them." So there I was, the only one bringing in any money, trying to cover all our expenses on just my tutor's salary. Bills piled up, and there was never enough to go around. Groceries, utilities, everything cost more with 4 adults in the house. One evening, I sat down with Jack and his parents to try to address the elephant in the room. "We need to talk about finances," I started, my hands clenched in my lap to stop them from shaking. "I'm the only one earning right now, and we're struggling to keep up with the bills." Mrs. Evelyn and Mr. Peterson looked at each other, then back at me. "But Jack's working. He can cover it," Mrs. Evelyn said, her voice full of misplaced confidence. Jack shifted uncomfortably beside me. "Actually, Mom, that's not true. I lost my job." The room went silent. Mr. Peterson coughed. "You what? Why didn't you tell us?" "I didn't want to upset you," Jack mumbled, staring at his hands. I took a deep breath and plunged ahead. "We can't cover everything on my salary alone. I was thinking maybe you could help out, contribute half the rent of your house to the family budget." Their reaction was as if I'd suggested something outrageous. Mrs. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Why should we? You have a job. You should be able to handle it. Jack always took care of things before." I was at my breaking point. "But I can't now. It's too much, and I need help." Jack put a hand on my shoulder. "Maybe just give me some time to find a new job, okay? I'll sort it out." I nodded, more out of exhaustion than agreement. Every day felt like wading through quicksand. The harder I worked, the deeper we sank into debt. It was during one of our usual tense dinners when Mrs. Evelyn casually threw out their latest extravagant plan. She waved a glossy travel brochure at me, her eyes glinting with excitement. "We're planning a little getaway, 2 weeks in Spain. So, darling, would you prefer a scarf or a shell as a souvenir?" I stared at her, my fork halfway to my mouth, completely thrown off. "A vacation? Now?" "Oh yes," she gushed, her enthusiasm undimmed. "And we were wondering if you could chip in a little. Just $2,000 for some pocket money. It's nothing too much, right?" I slammed my fork down, my patience finally snapping. "Where is all this money coming from? You spend on restaurants, clothes, now a vacation. And you haven't contributed a dime to the house expenses. How can you even ask for more money?" Jack's face paled, and Mr. Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Mrs. Evelyn just plowed ahead, oblivious. "Oh, we've been saving up, and a little help from family isn't too much to ask, is it?" "Saving? By leeching off us?" I shot back, my voice rising. "You don't pay for groceries, rent, nothing. And you still expect me to fund your trips?" Jack tried to interject, his voice tight. "Let's calm down and talk this." "No, I'm done talking," I interrupted, pushing back from the table. "You barge into my office, disrupt my work, and have the audacity to call this help? I have no space, no privacy. How is this a family?" Mrs. Evelyn's face crumpled, and she burst into theatrical tears. "How can you say such things, Tessa? We've done so much for you. We've even kept quiet about things, like how often we've talked Jack out of leaving you." The room went still. "What?" My voice was a whisper, disbelief etched into every syllable. "Jack, is that true?" Jack looked down, his face flushed with shame or anger, I couldn't tell. "Mom, what are you talking about?" But Mrs. Evelyn, clutching her chest, diverted the crisis. "Oh, my heart. This stress isn't good for me. Could you get my pills from upstairs, dear?" I stormed out of the room, my mind racing. Halfway up the stairs, I paused. Wait, what were the pills called again? I turned back, heading towards the dining room to ask, but stopped short when I heard Jack's hushed voice through the slightly ajar door. "No, Mom, you almost blew everything. We need to keep this quiet until we sell the house. If she leaves me now, I get nothing. Make sure you're not pushing too hard, just enough so she wants to sell." My heart sank as I listened, hidden from view. His words chilled me to the core. "We keep up the pressure, she sells, I divorce her, and get half. Then we can sell the old house and buy something better." Just keep it together, stop buying expensive stuff for a while, and coordinate with me first. I leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of their betrayal. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My marriage, my home, it was all a setup. Taking deep breaths, I composed myself and walked back into the dining room. Mrs. Evelyn was wiping her eyes, miraculously recovered. I forgot to ask, "What's the name of your medicine?" She smiled sweetly, a stark contrast to her earlier performance. "Oh, it's nothing, Tessa. I'm feeling much better now. Thank you." As I sat back down, I knew I had to play along. They didn't know that I knew, and I needed to keep it that way. Inside, I was reeling, but outwardly, I was calm. I needed a plan, and until then, I had to keep my cards close to my chest. The next morning, I woke up with a plan crystal clear in my mind. I canceled all my classes for the day, a first since I started tutoring online. I drove to the lawyer's office, my hands slightly trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. At the lawyer's, I laid everything out, the overheard conversations, my financial contributions, everything. The lawyer was meticulous, making sure that the divorce papers were ironclad, especially regarding the ownership of the house and my assets. "They won't see a cent of your property," he assured me, his voice firm and resolute. When I returned home, the atmosphere was stifling. Jack and his parents were in the living room, an air of impatient waiting hanging over them. As soon as I walked in, Mrs. Evelyn erupted. "Where have you been all day? You couldn't even bother to make dinner before leaving?" Her voice was shrill, echoing off the walls. I stood at the entrance, my resolve hardening. "I'm done cooking. And I'm done tolerating disrespect in my own house," I replied, my voice calm but ice cold. Jack stood up, his expression a mix of frustration and a poorly masked desperation. "Maybe it's best if we just sell the house and find somewhere else to go. Start fresh, you know, without my parents?" He was playing his part, thinking he was steering the conversation towards his goal. His parents froze, their faces a picture of greedy anticipation. But I couldn't help but laugh, a short, humorless sound that bounced sharply around the room. "Sell the house? Oh, Jack, I know about everything. Your plans with your parents. It's over." I pulled the divorce papers from my bag and slapped them down on the coffee table in front of him. "Here are the divorce papers. I want you and your parents out of my house immediately." The room erupted. Jack's face turned a deep red, his eyes wide in shock. Mrs. Evelyn began to sob dramatically, while Mr. Peterson stood up, his body tense with anger. "You can't do this to us, we're family." "That's no family of mine," I shot back. "You tried to cheat me out of my home, my security. It's done." Jack made a move as if to argue, but I cut him off. "I have recordings of your plans. My lawyer is fully aware of everything. Leave, or I will call the police." They gathered their things, Mrs. Evelyn wailing the entire time, while Mr. Peterson muttered curses under his breath. Jack looked defeated, the reality of his situation finally dawning on him as he realized the game was up. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. I threw myself into revamping the house, turning it back into the sanctuary it had been before. Each room was cleansed of any remnants of the past months, every cushion, every piece of linen that held any trace of them was replaced. One afternoon, while rearranging the living room, my phone buzzed. It was a call from Emma, a friend I hadn't spoken to in months, too embarrassed to tell anyone about the mess my life had become. "Hey, Tessa, I heard about the divorce." Emma's voice came through, tinged with concern. "How are you holding up?" I paused, paintbrush in hand, looking around at the half-finished room. "I'm okay, Emma. Actually, I'm better than okay. I'm starting something new. I'm expanding my online tutoring into a full-blown virtual academy. Planning to offer courses worldwide." We chatted a bit more, and after hanging up, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. My life was truly my own again, and I was going to make something incredible out of it. Days turned into weeks, and my project began to take shape. I hired a small team, working tirelessly to build a platform that wasn't just about learning, but about connecting people across the globe. The response was overwhelming. Students from different countries signed up, eager to be part of a community that promised more than just education. Several weeks later, Mrs. Evelyn called me. The house they had rented out burned down due to faulty electrical wiring, a disaster exacerbated by her failure to renew their insurance on time. "Can we stay with you, just for a little while? We have nowhere to go," she pleaded over the phone. The pause was brief. "No, Mrs. Evelyn," I replied firmly. "We are strangers now. I wish you the best." Hanging up, I felt a twinge of something, a remnant of the bond one thought we had. But stronger than that was the conviction in my own voice, the certainty in my choice.